Okay, well, good evening for another BioCentre seminar. We're very honoured today to have a familiar face, Dr. Helen Watt, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the BioCentre. It's very well known to us. She's also a Research Fellow at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and formerly of the Anscombe Centre for Bioethics. She's the author of two books, Life and Death in Healthcare Ethics, and more recently, The Ethics of Pregnancy, which is out from Routledge, and strongly recommended. She's also edited a number of volumes, including one on cooperation and complicity, and specializes really in tricky bioethical dilemmas. And so tonight's talk is on some moral dilemmas to do with the 14-day rule as they relate to human embryos in UK law. And without further ado, I'll pass on to Dr. Helen Watt.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Yes, so we're probably all aware of the 14-day rule, what it is. This is a rule saying that you're not allowed to experiment on embryos beyond the 14-day of development. And in some countries, this is a law, but internationally, it's been an expectation of scientists and the International Society for Stem Cell Research for a long time had a 14-day limit. But of course, it hasn't been possible until very recently to grow to embryos to anything like 14 days. And more recently, it has become possible. And in fact, in 2021, the International Society for Stem Cell Research lifted the 14-day limit, not replacing it with any limit at all. And some scientists were rather disconcerted by that. And one was asking, so can research embryos be taken in the lab to 20 weeks or 24 weeks? What are the limits on experiments on embryos? And of course, different people have different theories about what the limits should be. But I should say that a lot of what I'm going to be saying will be of some interest, whatever your view on when the embryo or fetus or even a postnatal individual has significant moral status. So a lot of these issues will be similar, whatever your view on that is. Now, my own position is that the embryo before as well as after 14 days is a morally significant subject. So it's the same individual who would later be born with objective interests in its future, and so on, as a rational kind of being. But yes, of course, some people think that it's older embryos who have moral significance, and some even who don't think that older embryos have as much significance as born human beings, nonetheless have some qualms about research on at least older embryos, if not early embryos. Now, of course, it is possible to defend the 14-day rule, even if you are opposed to all research on embryos. Backing the 14-day rule doesn't mean associating yourself with any embryo research. If you're associating yourself with what 14-day rule says you can't do. But there are some difficulties with this position that do need to be faced for anyone who does want to defend the 14-day rule, or indeed, as I say, any time limit for human research. So one immediate question is, what exactly are we intending when we try to exclude research after 14 days, assuming the embryo or the older embryo is worth protecting? Now, first sight, far from protecting the lives of embryos at or approaching 14 days, the 14-day rule actually requires that older embryos be destroyed if they might otherwise survive. And even if the argument is that the 13 or 14-day embryo has not yet acquired serious moral status, but is just about to acquire it, there is something odd in the idea that we protect the older embryo simply by ensuring the same embryo dies before 14 days. Whereas if we think that 13 or 14-day embryos already have significant moral status, it's much more difficult to defend a requirement that older embryos be destroyed before they reach the 14-day point. Because you're actually saying that some embryos should be destroyed. And if it's wrong to kill older embryos, isn't it wrong to intend that others, i.e. scientists doing embryo research, kill embryos, in this case, sooner rather than later? And in fact, given that most research embryos, at least at this point in the science, will die naturally soon after 14 days, if not before 14 days, doesn't the 14-day rule replace in effect, the natural death of these embryos with their deliberate destruction? One response to this might be to say, well, look, there's no requirement in the 14-day rule, at least in the UK, because there are different versions of the 14-day rule where it's a legal requirement in different countries. There's no requirement in the 14-day rule in the UK to destroy embryos. In UK law, the relevant phrase is that the embryo must not be kept or used after the appearance of the primitive streak, for which the limit is taken to be 14 days. But scientists mustn't be found with a living and growing embryo beyond that point. So how are scientists going to achieve that outcome? They're not having older embryos in their possession. And how are we, intending scientists, achieve that outcome? Might that not involve complicity in what's thought to be wrongdoing on the part of the scientist? So aren't you intending that the scientist intend the destruction of embryos? Now, how does the scientist experimenting on embryos avoid falling foul of the 14-day rule? For one thing, the scientist mustn't seek to extend the lives of older embryos, for one thing, but what reasoning connects this in the chain of ends and means with the aim of avoiding legal sanctions? So how does the how does the scientist avoid having an older embryo, a post-14-day embryo in his possession or her possession? Is that achieved only via deliberately engineering the embryo's death? I.e., are you withholding support from older embryos because you want them to die? Or rather intend them to die. It's more about what you intend than what you want. Now, omitting support can have various motivations, and we know this from the situation with, let's say, adult human patients. Often when we're treating critically ill people, we don't withhold or withdraw treatment because we intend the patient to die, but because we consider the means of extending life unjustified by any benefit likely to be obtained by the patient. So the burdens of the treatment for the patient or even for the health service may just be too great. So withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining interventions doesn't have to mean that you want the subject to die. However, what we certainly don't have with older human beings is some kind of rule such that, let's say, no patient may be supported in any way once they reach the age of 100. And if we did have any rule like that, that would raise concerns. That would look as if the aim is that centenarians not be alive. And if you regard embryos like centenarians as human subjects, similar intentions should arouse similar concerns. So what of a nursing home would face legal sanctions if someone found someone on their premises who was 100 years old, who obviously they'd been sporting in some way. We'd find that quite concerning. What you might say in response to that is that it's not life as such, it's further development that scientists are trying to prevent. And that if we're supporting rules like the 14-day rule, that we are trying to prevent. So let's say the aim is to prevent the embryo becoming sentient and experiencing pain. And it's true that if the scientist froze the embryo at 13 and a half days, that would still be within the 14-day rule, even though the embryo would still be alive after 14 days, even with a very little hope of being unfrozen. However, of course, freezing following research is very unlikely. In practice, researchers will not choose to freeze embryos, and certainly not to keep them frozen forever. And of course, that wouldn't even be legal, at least in some parts of the world, merely to avoid destroying them or falling foul of the 14-day rule. And it's not even clear that researchers should intend to freeze embryos and keep them frozen forever, because freezing is an extremely drastic kind of procedure. It stops all significant cellular activity, all development. And plausibly, it's only justified freezing is only justified if you've got some ethical way of supporting the individual at a later period. It's not justified just to keep someone frozen forever. This is a very, very extreme, albeit you could argue medical procedure. And in any case, of course, thwarting the embryo's development permanently would itself be a very difficult intention to defend if you assume that the embryo is already a morally significant individual. It's depriving that individual of most of the things of which death deprives them. It's keeping them in a state which is itself highly unfortunate. And in fact, an Australian bioethicist, Nicholas Tonti-Filippini, once suggested that embryos shouldn't be kept frozen and they shouldn't be just thawed and allowed immediately to die. He thought they should be transferred to a lab dish and given the basics, the kind of basic environment that would support them for a short while until their natural death. Obviously, the idea here is that the kind of warmth and nutrients in the lab dish is equivalent to basic support for a newborn baby, so a warm cot and a bottle, rather than something very high tech like ICU. But yes, to go back to the main point, so is the aim of developmental restrictions on embryo research that embryos not develop further, or is it that scientists not help them develop further? You could argue both, because even if the scientist didn't give the embryo anything towards the end of the period, the embryo might survive a little while with whatever it had in the dish to a point past the deadline, and so the scientist would still be falling foul of the rule, because the scientist would still have a living embryo past 14 days in his or her possession. But in any case, if the aim is to prevent scientists helping embryos to survive rather than the aim to prevent embryos surviving, how is that intention justified? Well, there is one intention. There is one defence you could give for that intention. I mean, let's assume that the embryo at that point, if not before, has significant moral status, objective interests in developing further, even though they've got little hope of developing very far, given the environment they're in. In that case, keeping that individual alive solely for experimental purposes, you might say that was demeaning to that individual against their dignity, particularly if they haven't given consent, obviously, to any such thing. We'll return to that. This question. In fact, I'll skip a bit and go straight on. So let's say that research use is morally excluded before as well as after 14 days. So in that case, you can still ask, which is morally worse? Is it worse to experiment on embryos for a fortnight and then destroy them? Or is it worse to experiment on them for a fortnight more and then destroy them? So if you assume all these embryos have equal status, whatever their age, you could argue that the second is worse, because it's got you might say, all the destructive intentions of the first, with the additional fact that the embryo will be instrumentalized for a longer period. And it's true that the longer you use someone, if you assume the embryo is someone, the longer you use them as a means to an end, the worse that seems to be. So you can think of some kind of dystopian scenario where people experiment on abandoned toddlers. Let's say it's painless, it's under constant sedation, but you experiment on them and then they die. Surely it's worth to do that for a month and then a fortnight, because that involves a longer period during which they're treated as a mere means to an end. Now, it's a little bit complicated because from the toddler's point of view, I mean, not exactly from their point of view, but considering the interests of the toddler, it's a fortnight extra research is not worse in every way because it does keep them alive. They do have an objective interests in life, like any living organism, whether alive or not. And as they're a rational kind of being, this interest and their other interests are particularly important. But yes, so it's a little bit complicated, but nonetheless, you've got to think of the harm to the perpetrator. It's certainly worse for the perpetrator to experiment on someone they shouldn't be experimenting on for a month rather than a fortnight. And yes, so how should we proceed? Well, one thing you might ask is, what about observational research? What about very low risk research or zero risk research? There is nothing, you might say, wrong with using someone in inverted commas as a means to an experimental end. You know, if consent has been obtained, whether from the individual themselves or from a surrogate. But yes, nonetheless, you've also got to consider the fact that allowing a longer research period, even factoring in the benefit of life to the subject to weigh against the harm of more prolonged experimentation, will encourage rather more use of embryos in research, because you'll be enabling new projects. So in addition to the short-term projects, embryo research projects that are already carried out, you'll be enabling new projects, and where the law allows it, you'll be encouraging the creation of embryos specifically for such new research. And at least if you assume certain things, these are very bad outcomes. Yeah, you've got to focus on the moral harm to scientists and society, as well as the exploitation harm for the subject. And for that reason, I'd say it is wrong to intervene to change the status quo, which, however objectionable morally on certain theories of the embryo, seems a lesser evil than the proposed alternative. When we change a rule or law, just like when we treat a patient, we should try and avoid doing more harm than good. And we don't, importantly, need to intend any wrongful actions committed in the status quo in order to defend the status quo, in the sense that we oppose withdrawing any restrictions the status quo retains. And these restrictions may be useful in that they don't just prevent particular harmful choices, but a general deterioration in social attitudes. You know, what's legal or what's institutionally permitted very quickly comes to seem acceptable and desirable, and that has knock-on effects and so on. So these are all outcomes we're trying to avoid. That still leaves us with the problem that the 14-day rule does in effect encourage the destruction of maturing embryos. If not the active destruction, then the discarding of maturing embryos, you know, very possibly with the aim of making them die. So what would be some ways of preventing research on older embryos which wouldn't have that effect? Is there anything lawmakers or regulators or scientific bodies might usefully prohibit without intending anything they shouldn't be intending, including any wrongful intentions of people? Well, in the first place, obviously, there is the possibility sometimes, if you have the political sport of prohibiting destruction or discarding of live embryos, ideally from conception, if that's when the individual begins, but if not from as early a point as can be achieved politically. yes, admittedly, that would leave observational research untouched, and in any case, the scientists who cease to support embryos, as I say, might well intend them to die. But this motivation wouldn't have to be present. It wouldn't be present in all scientists, and such a ban would send out a helpful message concerning respect for embryos. They couldn't just be poured down the sink live, discarded with medical refuse. They would have to be kept, for example, on the laptop until their natural demise. And it's worth remembering here that some IVF parents do want to bury their embryos, in fact, when their embryos who are not going to be implanted, or dispose of them in a way seen as respectful. That may be less the case with parents who donate their embryos for research, but it is worth remembering that parents sometimes have quite strong feelings about how their embryos should be treated. Another option would be to prohibit not continuing a research project, but beginning any research project that would last beyond 14 days, which would be one including attempts at extracorporeal implantation, so getting the embryo to implant on a scaffold. What you could do is ban these longer proposals at the point of the proposal or acceptance of the proposal. So the scientist or funder will be potentially in breach of the law or guidelines when this was proposed or when the proposal was accepted or funded. So that might be one way, or would be one way of keeping down the number of embryo research projects. Embryos would either be used in short-term projects or they wouldn't be used at all. Now, admittedly, some unwanted IVF embryos might then be discarded or destroyed sooner than they otherwise would be, though perhaps not. Parents do find it very difficult to decide about what to do about their leftover embryos, and it's not clear they would immediately discard them if the research option wasn't available. The rule would also mean that fewer embryos would be created specifically for this research where this was illegal, as in the UK, as longer projects would be excluded. Now, there remains the objection that, isn't the scientist putting together the research proposal precisely because it's a kind of research proposal that wouldn't sustain the embryo for too long, so not beyond a certain point. However, that doesn't mean that the choice not to sustain longer has to involve the intention the embryo die. You can imagine a research project involving very elderly patients where researchers could test a drug that could extend life significantly, but they choose not to because there are legal problems with the use of that drug. And the lawmakers might not be intending death either for older people. There might be very bad side effects for that drug. So yes, there can be reasons not involving the intention of death or making legal difficulties for the sustaining of a life in certain ways, and for avoiding those legal difficulties if you're a doctor or scientist. One specific possibility you might think about would be simply prohibiting any attempt to achieve the extracorporeal implantation of an embryo, though this is required for any survival of older embryos in vitro. It's very rash to say that that's morally obligatory support of embryos or even necessarily permissible. It's certainly not basic support, either morally or technically, at the current stage of the science. The embryo is not going to live very long because we don't know how to help an embryo live very long at this stage. Embryos don't have a clear right to this kind of support any more than adults do to very high-tech experimental procedures. And in any case, we're now looking at ectogenesis beyond the implantation stage. This itself raises some serious ethical problems. We're talking about completely replacing maternal nurture, and this is itself a morally contentious research aim. So that's one option you might choose. Yes, and this would certainly enable experiments on fetuses, and not just older embryos. If it became more and more possible to keep embryos alive outside a woman's body, is this something we want? So yes, just to conclude, for those who wish to restrict embryo research, whether because they see at least embryos after a certain point as full human subjects, or whether because they see them as worthy of at least some measure of respect, I've explored some ways in which this might be done while avoiding, or what I see as dangers of complicity in the wrongful intentions of others. Good ends don't justify bad means, and what I'd argue is that intending death for embryos, or intending that others, such as scientists, intend death for embryos, is an intention best avoided by anyone who sees the embryo as a morally significant human subject. A more defensible intention is that life-sustaining measures such as use of scaffolds be avoided, not because they're life-sustaining, but because they're disproportionate and socially harmful, on the assumption that replacing maternal gestation is a moral problem in itself. So you're not intending death for these embryos, but you're not intending certain kinds of life extension, and in fact the only kinds that are available at a certain point in development. A final point worth noting is we've been talking about more short-term interests of the embryo in respectful treatment, in not being used as means to an end, and so on. But there are also, at least on some views of the embryo, objective longer-term interests to consider. Interest of the embryo in its long-term future. Now, you might say, well, these embryos have already been donated to research, but in fact, you can see that as a fait accompli. But embryos, even after being donated to research, can be reclaimed actually by IVF parents, and moreover, in making more projects available, you'll be giving extra opportunities for giving the embryos up to research, rather than reconsidering your decision not to become pregnant with the embryos yourself if you're the woman. For many IVF parents, even not for all, this is still an option. And many parents do feel emotionally torn. They postpone decisions about the embryos year on year, knowing that it is still possible to have one of these embryos, or more than one, born as a baby. You can see the born siblings, and you think, well, there are other embryos still in the freezer, and so on. So we're not just looking at short-term respect for the embryo. We're looking at a long-term future with the embryo and the parents and any siblings, which may still be on the table for many IVF families. And if the embryo really is the same individual as the adult, if the embryo does have objective interests of a morally considerable kind in its future, then these longer-term interests, and not just the short-term interest and respect, need to be remembered in considering any restrictions in this area. So thank you very much, and I'd like to hear your questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. There's a great deal of food for thought there, and a very thorough examination of some of the moral issues. So I'll throw it open to anybody who wants to ask a question. I should just add, if anyone didn't see, Helen put a copy of the paper in the chat if any of you want to download that. Obviously, that will give more detail. So either let me know if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand or make some signal, or we can put something in the chat if you rather type. Well, in the absence of anything, I've just asked a quick question. I'm not sure it's very well. You seem to be talking about extraordinary means at one point and asking a question about, saying what we might give these embryos to carry on living would not be an ordinary means of support, but it's not the kind of thing that the embryo has a right to in the way that many adults don't have right to certain forms of don't have a prima facie right to certain forms of treatment, which go above ordinary means. What about someone who said that, the embryo, by being put in this position, has been wronged in some way, and therefore, is perhaps owed more than that which is ordinary means. And one way of showing that you take that obligation seriously is to, as it were, go an extra mile in attempting to prolong that life.
Well, that's an interesting thought, but the way I'd see it, what the IVF mother owes the embryo is her own care, her own maternal care. I mean, the fact that
But could that maternal care be expressed in this way, though?
well, it's not really maternal. I mean, it's not really maternal in the normal in the way. Well, in the way pregnancy is maternal, at least. I mean, it might be sort of maternally motivated. I mean, this might be a woman who says, "Well, yes, well, let's say it's someone who can't gestate the embryo or whatever. It might be maternally motivated, but I do think pregnancy is. I don't think pregnancy is something that we should feel at liberty to replace. I think it's very important in grounding a baby in the world, in connecting the baby to this particular woman. It's a way of sort of tracing back, where does this person come from? This is a person born from this woman, um, from this woman's relationship with this man, which is also a public thing, as pregnancy is also a public thing later on. You miss a lot if the embryo is just in a lab for 9 months. Yes, I don't think everything can be substituted. I mean, I don't have any objection to supplementing pregnancy. So people are working on artificial wombs at the end of gestation to support premature babies. I think that's different, because the baby would still be gestated by this woman, identifiable. This is the baby gestated by this woman, and then transferred to what is more like an incubator than anything else. But I think if you're replacing the whole shebang, I don't think this is good for the child's sense of identity. I don't think this is good for bonding with the child. I don't think it's somewhere society should be going.
Well, I mean, people might agree with a lot of that, but they might say, the child is here now. We might not be very happy about the way the whole thing came about or what that says about society, but there is a problem here where we can give some assistance. And if I mean, someone looking on with certain assumptions might say, if you really value the life of embryos in the way some people say they do, then that may mean, going to some lengths to ensure their survival. And we're talking about the actual survival of this embryo, which is one way, surely, of showing that we value it. And it seems as though you're
Yes.
saying that there are other considerations that can override that. And I'm wondering, and you've given some, but those are doing a lot of work if they're going to override the idea that you could do something that would help the embryo survive.
It's rather different, but postnatally, just because we want people to live, and that can also be an expression of, if it's your child, an expression of your maternal care or your paternal care. That doesn't mean that you want to do anything possible to help the child to live. And even if something wasn't painful, I mean, you can imagine things that would be so go so much against the child's physiology. Let's say they had, yes, they had to have, I don't know, let's say they had to have transplants every day, or yes, organs replaced every couple of days or something like that. There would come a point where you think that, that this is OTT. I mean, this is not respecting the child's physiology. So, okay, that's a different kind of objection to some kinds of support. But I think pregnancy isn't just any way of looking after a child. I think the feeling some of us have about surrogacy suggests that we don't see pregnancy as so easily replaceable, certainly not by human beings. Now, you could argue that surrogacy is different, because in surrogacy you now have a second mother, because pregnancy does make you a mother, at least as I'd see it, and that creates all sorts of issues. But again, I mean, if just any way of supporting a child is okay, then why not pay a woman to support your child, and or even try and talk around if she's not keen.
But isn't the point surrogacy is prearranged? That might be part of
Well,
some people's
surrogacy is
difficulties with
pre-arranged,
it.
but
Whereas this is a rescue situation.
well, in fact, I don't think it would be a rescue situation for a lot of. Okay, you can imagine a case where you've got a spare embryo, and you didn't know that you've got an embryo in the freezer, and you didn't know you were going to have a hysterectomy, so you can't now gestate this embryo. Yeah, I mean, that would be a surprise situation. That's true. But I think in terms of these scientists working on growing embryos further, I imagine, I have to look into it, but I imagine that they would often be creating the embryos for the purpose. I'm not sure, but because yes, I mean, embryos that get frozen are not the highest quality of embryos. So and scientists might feel they want to work with the highest quality of embryos, so they might want to create the embryos for the purpose and have everything just right for their experiment. But yes, I suppose it depends whether you think pregnancy is something very special, a very significant part of nurturing a child if you're a woman, something that can't be replaced so easily, something that says all sorts of things about the child's identity and origin, grounds a child in the world, and makes it clear to other people what child that is. And the pregnancy's got a lot going for it.
As readers of The Ethics of Pregnancy by Helen Watt can discover greater length. Okay, is anyone else with a question? Or, I mean, we can widen it as well to questions more generally about embryos and pregnancy, not just the 14-day rule.
Hi, yeah, I mean, we have discussed to some extent these topics with Helen, and I'm a scientist. I work in cancer biology, so I do come from a very lab-based perspective that I'm not really used to, ethical thinking. But I think you know, these topics and these points and these considerations will have a huge impact in the next 5 to 10 years, because you can think about these ethical issues when you think about embryos, IVF embryos, leftover embryos, which are used for research. But definitely there is a huge branch of research where embryos are created starting from stem cells or cell models which are available in the labs. And now it's technology is getting there. It's really getting there. And, you know, scientists will be able, I mean, I can't predict the future, but it looks like technologies will advance so that definitely beyond the 14 days, probably even months, these embryo will be sustainable, and there will be, you know, individuals created completely from scratch in the lab. And so it will be a major issue. So anything that can be done, as Helen explained, to prevent or control as much as possible the science that will come out, I think it will be very, very important. And there will be a lot of pressures on funders and the government to just carry on, because science needs to proceed. And you know, a lot of people think, oh, this research will bring a lot of information and understanding of other processes, so we will be able to cure other diseases more, which in principle I agree, you know, it makes sense, but at which price? And what are we really doing? I mean, we would never do any research on a 2-year-old, you know, right? Just because then we will acquire knowledge. But definitely you know, so sorry, I don't know if it's clear what I'm saying. And I have discussed this with Helen previously. So yeah, it's more
Yes,
of
I should say that Lucia was very helpful while I was thinking about these issues in the first place. And yes, I have inflicted this paper on Lucia before. So
Just can I just ask Lucia, amongst your fellow scientists, do you know, are there a significant portion that do have ethical quandaries in this area, or is it pretty sort of free for all attitude, and you know, science must proceed?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, I'm not involved with any you know, ethically problematic type of research, but I would say free flow is what I see mostly. It's difficult, and I think also as scientists we're not trained to think about the ethical issues behind what we do. We're just trained to think in a very scientific way. So consequences, we do these and this is what I get, these are the results, and this is the only thing I should think about. So yes, I don't think there is enough knowledge and people reflecting and thinking about what they do. So yeah, I mean, me in the first place, but if I have to think about the other scientists as well.
Yes, I mean that seems to be a fairly common, certainly in England. I don't know other countries as well, but
yeah. But the other experience that I had was, of course, in Italy. So I'm originally from Italy. I think it's quite consistent across countries.
Of course, some countries do have a law that's a lot stricter, certainly than the UK. I mean, Germany has a pretty strict law, actually. Yes, they have a slightly different definition of embryo. I think they define the embryo as at the 2-star stage or something. But basically, you can't do embryo research in Germany, so they just have to get there another way. In fact, I was talking to a scientist working in Germany about this recently. But yeah, I mean, you can understand that this kind of research is hugely interesting, and yes, certainly if you're not used to thinking about these issues in a different way, yes, I can quite see why people get carried away, or carried away as I see it.
So are there any other comments or general observations?
Well, just it was a very interesting talk, Helen. I can't think of a question clever enough to.
Oh, I'm sure you could, John, but well, thank you very much.
Well, can I just ask, I mean, sorry, this is a more general question, but what do you see as the prospects for law changes in England? You know, is there any?
There's a lot of appetite for it. You know, there's a big push to change the law.
Meaning to extend the
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they're holding these public consultations and so on, and yes, there's a big push.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering. It goes back to your paper a bit, but you know, could someone who held a particular view about the humanity of the embryo say, well, I'm giving them a bit of a longer life? You know, I mean, they might not be as concerned about the role of intention in ethical thinking, but at the same time think that you know, they don't like to see needless embryo destruction, and they just don't see a big deal about giving 2 weeks of extra life to a human embryo. As I mean, they find it hard to see why that's a big problem if there's no real solution in terms of embryo survival. I mean, what would be a quick way you would address that concern?
Yes, so you're saying that these embryos have been donated anyway. You know, these embryos aren't going anywhere, and isn't it more respectful, you know, to use these embryos to find out something interesting, you know, rather than just let them be discarded?
Well, I mean, some people even argue that you know, that gives more value to the embryo's life in that it's used for this research.
Well, this is very much the approach with parents. Actually, when clinics are talking to parents about their embryos, you know, yes, they're encouraged to use very very sympathetic, approachable language and so on, and yes, to talk about what you could achieve, you know, and then they're reassured. Actually, there was a webinar about this recently. Reassured that their embryo will be treated with every respect and so on. Well, I suppose you've just got to come back to the fact that, you know, we are talking about human subjects here, and yes, I mean, this is not a kind of research we would accept on human subjects at a later stage of development, and do we really want more of the same? And I mean, people might be asked, you know, how would you feel about research on a 20-week-old fetus, for example? I mean, you know, where would you draw the line? I mean, some people might draw the line at sentience, you know, but you could say, well, the research won't actually be painful, you know, we'll make sure it isn't. And
but if someone says that an embryo has a value and the age of the embryo isn't particularly significant in terms of the value of the embryo, why can't they say, well, you know, what's so shocking about having it at 28 days rather than 14? I mean, if unless you think somehow at 28 days it's much worse. See, someone could argue, actually, you know, it's less worse. You've allowed them more life.
if you allowed them more life, well, if you allowed them more life, but then there's the problem about if you're exploiting them for a longer period. So more exploitation is worse than less exploitation. So it's a bit swings and roundabouts. Okay, you know, the embryo and fetus gets to live for 20 weeks, but but that's 20 weeks, you know, well, that's many more weeks exploitation than it would otherwise have had. But yeah, then they could say, yes, it's got the same status as a 14-week-old embryo. In fact, they might say, well, even people have very different views on the embryo would agree with that. But they must have a point in their mind where they would say, well, no, now things are different. Now we're talking about 4 human subjects. And so I suppose just press them. What is that point? I mean, surely everyone's got a limit. You know, are they going to be happy experimenting on newborns, you know, or on 2-year-olds? You know, probably not.
Can I say something? I was I mean, when you were talking, thank you, Helen, for your talk. And I was thinking, I mean, in a way, I mean, 14 days has been quite an arbitrary limit. I mean, they try to relate this limit to a natural event, which is the primitive streak, but it was yeah, a very, I mean, man-made agreement. And I was wondering if the reluctancy in some states and even, of course, here there is a big push to extend the limit, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that all the scientific community, even though people don't agree with you morally agree with you in terms of considering an embryo like a human being, not everyone agrees in extending the limit, because in a way, pushing the limit to 28 days, maybe then in few years we can also agree in creating a baby in a lab. It's and what I noticed is that, for instance, what about cloning? No one is advancing the hypothesis to create clones, human clones. On this point, I mean, the scientific community, maybe I'm mistaken, but the scientific community looks to me they all agree that human cloning are forbidden.
Well, you say that. Yeah, so sorry, interrupted.
I know, and I was wondering whether we can find something else to less debatable to make the point that, I mean, of course, beyond 14 days, we cannot go, but something which is like, why the scientific community agreed on forbidding human cloning. Why human cloning now is not something that we wish to create? I mean, what is the issue there? I mean, can we find something else which is not, I mean, I don't know if you get my point.
Well, casting my memory back. I mean, when people were talking a lot about cloning, people were saying, "Oh, it's too dangerous," you know, and a lot of the time they're talking about a moratorium, or some of the time they're talking about a moratorium rather than no cloning ever. But cloning by a different method is actually getting more possible, because with these embryo models created from some created from adult stem cells, in effect, that's a different way of doing cloning. And there is an actual company which wants to produce, which wants to grow embryos for weeks, clone embryos and use them as sources of tissue for transplant. So this is one of the scientists who's been involved in embryo model research. Produced a big paper that was in Nature last year, and so on. So yes, I mean, people might say they don't want clones to be born as babies, but that's true. Yes, and in fact, the original agreement was about what they called reproductive cloning, so clones being born as babies. I mean, people talked about how, you know, there was the right to originality and so on, and people had various arguments they were using. And they also talked about physical risks because, I mean, I think some animals, you know, the clone would be much bigger than the animal gestating, who would normally be gestating that animal and so on. At least originally, I don't know whether that's still the case. But I think cloning is getting cloning even for birth. You know, it may be more likely with these embryo models that we're developing. You know, if they get, you know, if they get sufficiently, if they're in sufficient good shape to be born as babies.
And do you think that the law would permit creating human cloning?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if the scientists could say, well, look, we've been doing all this animal research and we can get very healthy lambs, you know, cloned lambs, and you know, starting with embryo models or whatever, you know, I mean, they might say the science has moved on, it's not dangerous anymore, you know, this will create babies for people who can't have babies.
Yeah.
I think people might not like it the first time they heard, but often you have these consultations and, you know, people put their case and, you know, people, you know, end up accepting it.
Mhm.
You mentioned embryo models. I mean, are you assuming that these embryo models are actually human embryos or could be?
Well, some of the new ones, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but some of the new ones, you know, look pretty good, and some scientists are actually talking about, you know, it's not at all impossible that it will be possible to, not at all impossible that people will be able to gestate them in the future, and they haven't got very far with animals, but I think animals have gestated them for a bit. I mean, you still got to argue, are these actual embryos? But the better models they are, the more, you know, the more it looks like they are embryos. I mean, it's a different way of creating embryos, but then cell nuclear replacement is a different way of creating an embryos, and that creates embryos.
Yes, and Lucia was just telling us that we could be seeing a lot more of this kind of thing.
Something
Well,
to look forward to.
I was going to say that bioethicists won't be going out of business anytime soon.
No, we'll be fine. We'll be fine.
For good or ill. Well, it just remains for me to say, if there's no other questions, thank you very much indeed for the talk, Helen, and your virtual clap. And we will let you know about the next bar seminar, and also any news about the bar centre through email and social media channels. So thank you very much, and have a very good evening wherever you